Today I will tell you the extraordinary story of a small girl who changed the heart of her country's most powerful leader. It all began when Ibrahim Traoré visited a rural hospital and a sick child begged him not to leave, never imagining what would happen next. But the outcome exceeded all expectations. The sun beat mercilessly on the dusty streets of Gowa, the third largest city in Burkina Faso. Despite the suffocating heat, a crowd had gathered in front of the small provincial hospital, awaiting the arrival of President Ibrahim Traoré. The visit, announced just the day before, was part of a tour through regions affected by insecurity and healthcare crises that had plagued the nation for years. The presidential convoy moved slowly along the main road, a stark contrast to the ostentatious displays typical of other African leaders. Traoré traveled with a reduced escort. 2 military vehicles, his personal car, and an ambulance carrying medical supplies. This austerity, characteristic of the young captain since he took power in 2022, had earned him the respect of a population, weary of corruption and the privileges of the political class. The convoy consisted of battle-worn vehicles rather than luxury limousines. The lead vehicle, a modified pickup truck mounted with a machine gun, was manned by soldiers who had fought alongside Traoré in the northern campaigns against terrorist groups. These weren't ceremonial guards, but combat veterans who understood the real threats facing their nation. "Mr. President, we'll arrive in 5 minutes," informed his aide, a lieutenant with a serious gaze who rarely left his side. The hospital director and local authorities waited at the entrance, their nervousness palpable even from a distance. Many had never hosted such a high-ranking official, and rumors about Traoré's uncompromising stance on corruption had spread throughout the administrative hierarchy. Traoré nodded without looking up from the documents he was reviewing. Statistics on malaria and child malnutrition in the northern region. The figures were alarming, exacerbated by the displacement of thousands of families fleeing armed groups at the border with Mali. Children were dying at rates that would shame any civilized nation, and yet the resources allocated for their care mysteriously disappeared before reaching those who needed them most. "Have we confirmed delivery of the medicines promised by the WHO?" he asked, underlining a discrepancy in the reports that caught his attention. "Not yet, sir. According to our sources, the trucks have been held at the border for 3 days. Bureaucratic problems, they say." The aide's tone carried the weight of someone who had seen too many bureaucratic problems that miraculously resolved themselves with bribes. The president frowned, his weathered face showing the strain of leading a nation under siege. He knew all too well about those types of bureaucratic problems. "Call the Minister of Health. I want those medicines here tomorrow, with or without the bureaucrats' approval." The vehicle stopped in front of the modest concrete building that served as the main medical center for the entire province, a single-story structure painted white and blue, with a weathered sign identifying it as Gowa Provincial Hospital. Far from the modern hospitals of the capital, this center fought daily against shortages of resources and personnel, a battle it was slowly losing. As he stepped out of the car, Traoré was greeted by a group of visibly nervous officials. The hospital director, a man of about 50 with a white coat and exhausted expression, stepped forward to greet him. His hands trembled slightly as he extended them, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the early morning hour. "It is an honor to receive you, Your Excellence." "Welcome to our humble hospital," he said, his voice betraying years of dealing with insufficient resources and impossible demands from superiors who lived comfortably in the capital. "The honor is mine, Dr. Ouedraogo," Traoré replied, surprising the director by calling him by name. This simple gesture, showing that the president had taken time to learn about the people he was visiting, immediately set him apart from previous officials who barely acknowledged local staff. "I'm here to see reality, not ceremonies." The entourage entered the building, and the contrast with the external heat was minimal. Ceiling fans barely moved the stale air. The walls, though clean, showed years of wear and makeshift repairs. In the waiting rooms, patients sitting on wooden benches observed with curiosity and hope the arrival of the young president, many having traveled for hours just for the chance of decent medical care. The interior told a story of dedicated healthcare workers struggling against impossible odds. Nurses moved efficiently between patients, making the most of limited supplies. Equipment from the 1990s hummed and wheezed, kept running through the ingenuity and determination of maintenance staff who had become masters of improvisation. The smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of overcrowding and inadequate ventilation. "We'll begin with the pediatric ward," proposed the director, gesturing toward a corridor lined with motivational posters that seemed almost mocking in their cheerful optimism. "We've prepared a presentation about our most urgent needs." "I prefer to see the patients first," Traoré interrupted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Presentations can wait." The decision took the official entourage by surprise. Presidential. Visits usually followed strict protocols with rehearsed tours and carefully orchestrated encounters. But Traoré, true to his direct style, was already advancing down the main hallway, his military boots echoing on the worn linoleum floors. The pediatric ward was a rectangular space with 10 beds, each occupied by at least one child. Some were, accompanied by their mothers, who fanned them tirelessly with pieces of cardboard torn from medicine boxes. The smell of medication mixed with disinfectant and human suffering, creating an atmosphere that spoke of too many children fighting battles they shouldn't have to face. The ward's windows, several with cracked glass, were covered with mosquito nets that had seen better days. Colorful drawings made by previous patients decorated the walls, their cheerful images a stark contrast to the reality of illness and want that permeated the room. A single television in the corner played cartoons with no sound, its screen flickering occasionally from power fluctuations. A young nurse, startled by the sudden arrival of the president, dropped the folder she was holding, papers scattering, across the floor like fallen leaves. Traoré bent down to collect them before she could, his actions watched by every person in the room. "Continue with your work," he said kindly, returning the documents to her trembling hands. "I'm just observing." 4. The next hour, the president toured the ward, stopping at each bed. He spoke with parents, asked about symptoms, listened to doctors' explanations about available treatments and those that weren't accessible. He didn't take notes or make grandiose promises. He simply listened with attention that disconcerted officials accustomed to distracted leaders who treated such visits as photo opportunities. At each bedside, stories unfolded that painted a picture of systematic neglect. A 5-year-old boy with pneumonia whose parents had sold their motorcycle to pay for antibiotics that should have been free. Twin girls suffering from severe malnutrition because their village's food distribution center had been looted by corrupt officials. An infant with meningitis whose mother had walked 40 kilometers carrying him, only to find the hospital's isolation ward had been closed for 3 months due to maintenance issues. The president's expression grew darker with each story, though he maintained his composure. His aide noticed the telltale tightening around Traoré's eyes, a sign that had preceded some of the most decisive moments in the young leader's career. It was at the last bed, next to the window, where the encounter occurred that would change everything. Amina, a 7-year-old girl with large, dark eyes and arms thin as branches, watched the president with curiosity. Unlike other children who seemed intimidated by the military uniform and the crowd of officials, she met his gaze with a mixture of courage and fragility that spoke of wisdom beyond her years. The window beside her bed looked out onto a courtyard, where other families waited in whatever shade they could find. Some had been there for days, sleeping on mats and sharing what little food they had brought from home. Their quiet dignity in the face of suffering struck everyone who saw them, but it was this little girl who would give voice to their silent pleas. "What's your name?" Traoré asked, approaching the bed with the same careful attention he had shown every other child. "Amina, sir," she replied with a weak but clear voice that carried an unmistakable strength despite her physical condition. "Do you know who I am?" The girl nodded solemnly. "You're the president. My father says you're different from the others, that you actually care about people." Her words carried no flattery, just the straightforward honesty that only children possess. Traoré smiled, moved by the child's sincerity. Around him, officials tensed, unsure how their leader would react to such direct commentary from someone so young. "And what do you think? Do you believe I care about people?" Amina seemed to seriously consider the question, her small face scrunched in concentration. "I don't know. You just got here," she replied finally, provoking spontaneous laughter from the president and tension among officials horrified by what they considered disrespectful boldness. But Traoré was delighted by her honesty. "You're absolutely right, Amina. Words don't mean anything until they become actions." The doctor, nervous about the turn of the conversation, intervened with medical details he hoped would redirect the discussion to safer ground. "Amina suffers from a severe form of sickle cell anemia. She's been with us for 3 weeks, waiting for a compatible blood transfusion and specialized medications." "And why doesn't she have them yet?" Traoré's question, though asked calmly, carried the weight of his authority and years of military command. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "The specific medications must be imported, and the regional blood bank is understocked." The euphemism fooled no one in the room. Understocked meant that supplies had been diverted, probably sold on the black market or sent to private clinics where wealthy patients paid exorbitant prices for what should have been freely available to all citizens. Traoré turned back to Amina, his expression softening as he focused on the child rather than the systematic failures surrounding her. "Does it hurt a lot?" The girl nodded slightly, then seemed to gather her courage. "Sometimes. But I'm brave," she said, lifting her chin with a defiance that made several adults in the room feel ashamed of their own complaints about minor inconveniences. "Yes, I can see that. You're very brave indeed." The conversation was interrupted by a nurse who approached the director, whispering something urgent in his ear. The doctor consulted his watch and then addressed the president with barely concealed relief. "Sir, the helicopter will be ready in 20 minutes. We must continue with the tour if we want to meet the itinerary." The schedule called for visits to 4 more locations that day, each carefully planned to showcase government initiatives in the best possible light. Traoré stood up, prepared to continue with the visit. The entourage began moving toward the door, officials already mentally preparing for the next stop. It was then that he felt a small hand grasping the sleeve of his uniform with surprising strength. "Don't go, please," Amina pleaded, her eyes suddenly wet with tears that threatened to spill over. "When you're here, everyone is kind, and everything works better. If you leave, it will go back to how it was before." Time seemed to stop. Officials, doctors, and security guards held their breath, stunned by what they considered an unforgivable breach of protocol. No one touched the president without authorization, and certainly no one asked him to stay when duty called elsewhere. Some of the older officials looked scandalized, already mentally composing reports about the need for better crowd control during future visits. But Traoré showed no annoyance. On the contrary, his expression reflected profound emotion, as if the simple words of this child had penetrated all his defenses and reached something deep within his soul. For several seconds, that felt like eternity. The powerful military leader and the small patient looked into each other's eyes, communicating in a language that transcended words and official protocols. Finally, Traoré did something no one expected. He sat on the edge of the bed and took Amina's hand in both of his calloused soldier's hands gentle around her small fingers. "I won't leave until I make sure you receive what you need," he promised, with a determination that his assistants knew well, the same tone he had used when announcing his intention to rid the country of terrorist threats. And when I do leave, things won't go back to how they were before. I give you my word." An absolute silence reigned in the pediatric ward. President Traoré's promise to little Amina had left everyone present bewildered and uncertain about what would happen next. The hospital director, visibly uncomfortable, approached and attempted to intervene with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Your Excellence, the helicopter is waiting. We have 4 other localities scheduled for today, and the delay could affect—" Traoré raised his hand, indicating silence with a gesture that brooked no argument. "Dr. Ouedraogo, I need your phone," he requested calmly, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the room understand that something fundamental had changed. The doctor, confused and increasingly nervous, handed over his cell phone with trembling fingers. Traoré dialed a number and waited while everyone watched in tense silence, the only sounds the quiet hum of medical equipment and the distant murmur of conversations in the corridor. "Colonel Sangaré, cancel the remaining visits for today," he ordered when someone answered, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "Send the helicopter back with the infrastructure minister. I'll be staying in Gawa tonight." The officials exchanged panicked glances. Nothing in their extensive protocol training had prepared them for a situation like this. Presidential visits were choreographed down to the minute, with security details, press arrangements, and diplomatic protocols all carefully coordinated, weeks in advance. The head of presidential security approached discreetly, his face a mask of professional concern. "Sir, we cannot guarantee your security without prior preparation. This region still registers terrorist activity and—" "Lieutenant," Traoré interrupted with a sharp tone that reminded everyone present of his military background, "are you suggesting that this hospital is not safe? Because the patients and medical staff live here in constant danger?" The officer fell silent, trapped by his own logic. How could he argue that the president needed special protection in a place where ordinary citizens, including children like Amina, faced the same risks every day? "We'll organize what's necessary," he conceded finally, already mentally calculating the security arrangements that would need to be implemented within hours. Traoré returned his attention to Amina, who had watched the entire exchange with amazement, her large eyes growing wider as she began to understand that this powerful man was actually going to stay because of her simple request. "It looks like I'll be staying a bit longer," he told her with a warm smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Now, Dr. Ouedraogo, I need to understand exactly why this child hasn't received her treatment." The director, sweat forming, beads on his forehead despite the air conditioning that had mysteriously started working perfectly since the president's arrival, began explaining the bureaucratic difficulties, national shortages of certain medicines, and budgetary limitations that plagued the healthcare system. Traoré listened attentively, but his expression hardened with each excuse. He had heard variations of these same explanations in military briefings, where officers tried to explain why equipment hadn't reached the front lines or why soldiers lacked basic supplies while facing terrorist threats. "Where is the head of pharmacy?" he asked finally, cutting through a particularly elaborate explanation about import regulations. A middle-aged woman in a white uniform with a nervous expression stepped forward. "I am, Mr. President. Fatoumata Sangaré." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and her hands shook as she clasped them in front of her. "Mrs. Sangaré, do you have an updated inventory of the hospital's medications?" "Yes, Your Excellence." The words came out in a rush. "Good. I want to see it now, along with the records of requests from the last 6 months." The pharmacist visibly paled. "The records are in the process of being updated. The computer system has had failures and—" "The paper records," Traoré cut her off, "which you must maintain by law, independent of any computer system." The silence that followed was answer enough. The presidential aide, understanding the situation with the quick comprehension of someone who had dealt with corruption at multiple levels, was already on his phone requesting the urgent presence of the regional director of health and the head of the local gendarmerie. While officials scurried away to locate the requested documentation, Traoré remained beside Amina. The child watched him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity that reminded him of his own daughter, safe in a private school thanks to his position, while children like Amina suffered for lack of basic medical care. "Are you really the president?" she asked in a quiet voice, still somewhat incredulous that such an important person would spend time talking to her. Traoré smiled genuinely. "Yes, I am, though sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. My teacher says you used to be a soldier." "I still am," he responded with simplicity that cut through all pretense. "We're all soldiers for something, Amina. Some fight with weapons, others with medicines like the doctors here. You're also fighting your own battle." Amina's mother, who had remained silent out of fear and respect, finally found the courage to speak. "We've sold almost everything we had to pay for treatments," she confessed, her voice breaking with the strain of months of worry and financial desperation. "My husband works in the northern mines. We haven't seen him for 3 months, but he sends everything he earns." The story was painfully common throughout Burkina Faso. Thousands of families lived separated by economic necessity, with fathers working in dangerous conditions in gold mines or cotton fields to afford basic necessities that should have been provided by the state. Traoré remained silent for several moments, processing not just this individual tragedy but the systemic failures it represented. Then he pulled out his personal phone, the secure device he used for the most sensitive government communications. "I need to make another call," he said, stepping away a few paces from the bed. He spoke briefly with someone, giving precise instructions, in a tone that brooked no argument. When he returned, his expression showed renewed determination, the look his military colleagues recognized as preceding decisive action. "Mrs. Diallo," he said, addressing Amina's mother by name, "in 2 hours, a specialist will arrive from Ouagadougou along with the medications Amina needs." The mother's eyes filled with tears of relief and disbelief. "But, sir, we cannot pay for a specialist from the capital. We've already spent—" "You won't have to pay," Traoré assured her with finality. "Not today, not ever. Amina's treatment, and that of all children with similar conditions, will be covered by the state, as it always should have been." The news spread rapidly through the hospital corridors like wildfire. Patients and staff crowded around doors and windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the president who had caused such a commotion with his unprecedented decision to extend his stay and provide immediate help to a single child. Meanwhile, in a small, administrative office, the atmosphere was very different. The hospital director, the pharmacy chief, and the administrator were engaged in heated, whispered arguments that revealed years of systematic corruption. "This is your fault," the administrator accused the pharmacist. "I warned you about maintaining duplicate records." "My fault?" she shot back with barely contained fury. "You were the one who diverted the last shipment of medicines to your brother-in-law's private clinic." The director silenced them both with a sharp gesture. "Enough! We don't have time for this. We must present something credible before the gendarmerie arrives." What none of them knew was that Traoré had positioned a young lieutenant from his inner circle just outside the door, listening to every word of their panicked confessions. The web of corruption was unraveling with each desperate accusation. As evening approached, a military helicopter landed on the sports field adjacent to the hospital, its rotors sending clouds of dust swirling through the fading light. From it descended a medical specialist with his equipment, 3 officers from the anti-corruption brigade, and, to everyone's surprise, the Minister of Health himself. The minister, a corpulent man of about 60 who had served under 3 different governments, looked profoundly uncomfortable as he hurried through the hospital corridors. His usual confidence, built on years of managing health budgets and international aid funds, seemed to have evaporated in the face of this unprecedented presidential intervention. Mr. Minister, Traoré greeted him with cold formality when he entered the pediatric ward. Thank you for responding to my call so quickly. The official, visibly nervous and sweating despite the air conditioning, attempted to project his usual authority. It's my duty, Your Excellence, though I confess my surprise at this unusual situation. Unusual? Traoré's tone was deceptively soft, like the calm before a storm. Do you find it unusual that the President takes interest in the real functioning of our health system? The minister cleared his throat nervously, already sensing that his comfortable position atop the healthcare hierarchy was under threat. Of course not. I was only referring to— I know perfectly well what you were referring to. Traoré cut him off with the precision of a blade. Come with me. We have much to discuss. While the specialist examined Amina and began preparing the transfusion she desperately needed, Traoré led the minister to an empty room. His presidential assistants prevented anyone else from entering, but the president's raised voice could be heard clearly through the thin walls of the provincial hospital. Unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable, his voice thundered, carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in life-or-death situations. Children dying for medicines we've already paid for, diverted funds, and you talk to me about administrative procedures. The one-sided conversation continued for nearly an hour, with the minister's responses growing increasingly weak and apologetic. Staff members and patients alike had never heard such a direct confrontation between high-ranking officials, and the effect was electrifying. Night fell over Gawa as Traoré returned to the pediatric ward. The Minister of Health followed him, visibly pale and shaken, his usual arrogance replaced by the demeanor of someone who had just received the most severe professional reprimand of his career. Without a word, the president approached Amina's bed, where the specialist was completing the treatment that would save her life. The child's color was already improving, and her breathing seemed less labored. How is she? Traoré asked the doctor, his voice gentle after the harsh tones that had dominated his conversation with the minister. Responding well, Your Excellence, the specialist replied with professional satisfaction. With proper treatment and regular follow-up, her prognosis is very favorable. Traoré nodded with visible relief and turned to Amina's mother, who sat beside the bed holding her daughter's small hand. Mrs. Diallo, starting tomorrow, your husband will be transferred to a position in Gawa. He won't have to work in the mines anymore. The woman looked at him in disbelief, her mind struggling to process this unexpected turn of events. But, Mr. President, how is that possible? It's already arranged, he assured her with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions and seeing them implemented. No father should have to choose between being with his family and supporting them. At midnight, when most of the hospital staff and officials had gone home, Traoré remained seated beside Amina's bed, watching over the sleeping child. Only his personal aide stayed nearby, providing periodic updates on the investigation that was rapidly expanding beyond the walls of this single hospital. The anti-corruption officers have confiscated all records, the aide reported in a low voice. Initial evidence confirms systematic diversion of medicines and supplies over several years. How long has this been happening? Traoré asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. At least 3 years, sir, and not just here. The pattern appears to be repeated in several regional hospitals across the country. Traoré contemplated the sleeping child, her breathing now regular and peaceful. The immediate crisis was over, but the systemic problems that had nearly cost this little girl her life extended far beyond Gawa Provincial Hospital. Prepare a national announcement for tomorrow, he ordered, and contact all provincial governors. This has only just begun. Dawn found Ibrahim Traoré in the same chair beside Amina's bed, having spent the entire night alternating between brief rounds through other wards and conversations with patients and staff. His security guards, initially alarmed by this unusual behavior, now maintained discreet vigilance while marveling at their president's dedication. The transformation in the hospital was already visible. Equipment that had been under repair for months was suddenly functioning. Staff members who rarely appeared were now working full shifts. The pharmacy, once mysteriously understocked, had received emergency supplies during the night. Word of the president's presence and his direct intervention had created an atmosphere of renewed hope and activity. Amina awakened to find the president still there, and for a moment she seemed surprised that her request for him to stay had actually been honored by such an important person. "Good morning, Amina," Traoré greeted her with a gentle voice. "How do you feel?" "Better," she replied, sitting up slightly with more strength than she had shown in weeks. "It doesn't hurt as much anymore." The specialist arrived to conduct a morning evaluation and confirmed the improvement. The treatment was taking effect, and the child's condition was stabilizing rapidly. "We'll continue with intravenous medication for 3 more days," he explained to both the president and Amina's mother. "Then she can continue treatment at home with weekly checkups." Traoré nodded with satisfaction, then turned to Amina with a serious expression that didn't hide his genuine affection for the brave little girl. "I have to leave now," he said carefully. "Not because I want to, but because there are many children like you throughout the country who also need help." The little girl looked at him with her large dark eyes, processing his words with the wisdom that serious illness often brings to young children. "Will you come back to visit me?" "I promise you I will. And meanwhile, these people," he gestured, to 2 young officers who stepped forward, "will stay to ensure you receive everything you need." Amina's mother, returning with hot tea from the hospital cafeteria, stopped when she heard this exchange. "Mr. President, you've already done 2. Much for us." "No, Mrs. Diallo," he interrupted with firm conviction. "I haven't done even 1/10 of what should be done. What your daughter is receiving now isn't a favor. It's her right as a citizen of this country." By mid-morning, Traoré had left the hospital. But rather than heading to the helicopter that waited to take him back to the capital, he walked toward the provincial administrative center. He was followed by his entourage and a growing crowd of citizens who had learned of his extended presence in their neglected region. The sight was unprecedented, a head of state walking through the streets of a provincial town, accessible to ordinary citizens who had grievances to air and stories to tell, vendors, students, mothers carrying children, elderly men who had fought in previous conflicts, all joined the impromptu procession. At the seat of provincial government, the governor and several officials received him with evident nervousness. News of the hospital arrests during the night had already circulated throughout the city, and many administrators feared that the healthcare audit would extend to their own departments. "Convene all department heads," Traoré ordered without preamble. "Emergency meeting in 10 minutes. The conference room quickly filled with uncomfortable officials. Some carried hastily assembled documents, fearing that the hospital audit would spread to their areas of responsibility. Others simply looked terrified, knowing that their own records would not withstand scrutiny. Traoré remained standing, rejecting the main chair they offered him, preferring to pace as he addressed the assembled officials with the bearing of a military commander addressing his officers. "Last night I witnessed something that should never happen in our country," he began, his voice controlled but loaded with determination. "A 7-year-old girl almost died because medicines the state had already paid for never reached her hands." He scanned the room, observing each official's reaction, reading their faces with the skill of someone trained to assess enemy positions under pressure. This is not an isolated problem. It's a corrupt system that functions exactly as it was designed, to benefit a few at the expense of the most vulnerable. The provincial governor, a veteran politician appointed by the previous regime, attempted to intervene with practiced political smoothness. "Your Excellence, I assure you that we will thoroughly investigate what happened at the hospital." "That won't be necessary," Traoré cut him off with military precision. "The Anti-Corruption Brigade is already conducting the investigation." 3. People were arrested last night, including the hospital director and the head of regional medical supply chains. A sepulchral silence fell over the room. Several officials visibly paled. their minds racing through their own questionable activities and wondering if they would be next. "But I haven't come to discuss the past but the future," the president continued. "Starting today, we will implement the Amina protocol in all health facilities across the country." The announcement provoked confused murmurs. No one had heard of such a protocol before, and the name itself was intriguing. "It's a system of total transparency," Traoré explained with the clarity of someone who had thought through every detail. "Every medicine, every medical supply, every franc destined for health care will be traceable from its origin to its final destination." He paused for effect, letting the implications sink in among the assembled officials. And ordinary citizens, like Amina's mother, will be able to verify for themselves where the resources that belong to them are located. The proposal was revolutionary and, for many present, terrifying. It meant the end of decades of opaque dealings and systematic diversions that had enriched administrators while impoverishing the healthcare system. "This is only the beginning," Traoré warned before concluding the meeting. "What I saw in that hospital will not happen again while I am president, and whoever thinks they can continue with the old practices should know that there will be no place remote enough to hide." Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the president's absence had unleashed all kinds of speculation among the political class. Ministers and advisors constantly called his team, receiving vague responses about an unforeseen extension of the provincial visit. The Minister of Health, who had returned on the helicopter the previous night, convened an urgent meeting with his inner circle. His usually confident demeanor was replaced by visible anxiety as he briefed his subordinates on what had transpired. "The situation is serious," he informed them, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose comfortable world had been shaken. "The president has ordered immediate audits of all hospitals in the country. He speaks of systematic diversions and accountability at the highest levels." One of his advisors, a thin man with metallic glasses who had survived multiple government changes, intervened with the calculating tone of a professional survivor. "We should control the narrative before this becomes a national scandal. We could present it as isolated cases, bad apples in an otherwise sound system." "It's too late for that," the minister interrupted with growing desperation. "He spent the entire night talking to patients and staff. He knows the details, the patterns, even the names of those involved at superior levels." The panic in the room was palpable. For years, the ministry had functioned as a well-oiled machine where each participant received their share of the health budget before it reached its official destination. The system had been so entrenched that many considered it simply the way things worked. "What about our allies?" suggested another advisor, his mind racing through political connections. "The French have considerable influence. Perhaps they could help moderate this reformist impulse." The minister shook his head with the certainty of someone who had misjudged his opponent. "Traoré isn't like the previous ones. He doesn't answer to foreign powers. If we try that route, we'll only make our situation worse." In the streets of Gaoua, something unprecedented was happening. News of the president's extended presence and the nighttime arrests had spread like wildfire throughout the region. Hundreds of people congregated in front of the hospital and administrative center, but these weren't the usual organized demonstrations that accompanied official visits. This time, citizens arrived on their own initiative, many carrying sick children, or supporting elderly relatives who had been denied adequate care. The spontaneity of the movement took both the presidential team and local authorities by surprise. "We want to be heard," shouted voices from the crowd. "If he helped Amina, he can help all of us." The grassroots nature of the gathering, with no political party organization or official sponsorship, represented something new in Burkina Faso's political landscape. These were ordinary people who had found hope in the story of a little girl whose simple plea had moved their president to action. Traoré, informed of the situation by his security team, made a decision that left his advisors stunned. Rather than addressing the crowd from a safe distance or through intermediaries, he chose to speak directly with the people who had gathered. "I cannot solve all problems today," he admitted with the honesty that had become his trademark. "But I can promise you that every case will be heard, every complaint investigated, and every responsible party will face consequences." An elderly man pushed through the crowd, his weathered face showing the strain of years of struggle. "Mr. President, we've been suffering for years. We pay for medicines that never arrive. Our children die waiting for treatments that exist but aren't available to us." "I know," Traoré responded with barely contained emotion that surprised those who knew him as a controlled military leader. "I've seen it with my own eyes, and I swear to you that this will change." Someone from the crowd shouted, "No more empty promises! We want actions!" Far from being offended, Traoré nodded with understanding. "You're right to distrust promises. You've been lied to for too long. That's why I'm not asking you to believe my words, but to observe my actions, starting right now." He then made an announcement that surprised everyone present, including his own security team. He would temporarily establish his office in the provincial hospital. For an entire week, he would work from there, personally supervising the implementation of the Amina protocol. Social media exploded with news of the encounter. Videos of the meeting between the president and the crowd went viral, generating reactions throughout the country and beyond its borders. The hashtag Amina protocol began circulating alongside the phrase, "Don't leave, please," which had become a symbol of hope placed in the young leader. In the capital, the impact was immediate. Officials from various ministries began discreetly regularizing questionable situations, fearing they would be next to face investigations. Some even submitted hasty resignations, citing personal reasons or health problems as pretexts for their sudden departures. Television networks struggled to keep up with the rapidly developing story. International journalists, initially attracted by the unusual sight of an African president spending the night in a provincial hospital, found themselves covering what appeared to be a genuine grassroots revolution in healthcare transparency. The story resonated beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Other African nations watched with interest as a young leader demonstrated that genuine reform was possible, even in systems long considered hopelessly corrupt. Opposition leaders in neighboring countries began referencing the Amina model in their own campaigns for change. Meanwhile, in her modest hospital bed, unaware of the whirlwind she had unleashed, Amina Diallo slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The medicine that had been denied to her finally flowed through her veins, fighting the disease that had threatened her young life. Her mother, sitting beside her as she had for countless nights, looked out the window at the unusual activity in the normally forgotten provincial hospital. Doctors who never appeared were now making regular rounds. Equipment that had been broken for months was functioning again. Staff who used to be absent were punctually fulfilling their shifts. "Do you think it will last?" she asked a nurse who was adjusting Amina's IV drip. "When the president leaves?" The woman smiled with a mixture of hope and skepticism born from years of disappointment. "I don't know, but for the first time in many years, I have the feeling that something is really changing." 3 months had passed since that day when Amina begged the president not to leave, and Burkina Faso was no longer the same country. The transformation was visible everywhere, from the smallest rural clinics to the major hospitals in Ouagadougou. The morning began at the Central Hospital of Ouagadougou, renovated and bustling with activity. Doctors and nurses moved with renewed energy through corridors now bright and clean. At the main entrance, an electronic sign displayed real-time inventory of available medicines, their expiration dates, and patients assigned to each treatment. The Amina protocol had been implemented in over 80% of the country's health facilities, creating a level of transparency never before seen in West Africa. Citizens could track medical supplies from international purchase to bedside delivery, eliminating the opacity that had enabled systematic theft for decades. Amina, completely recovered, walked hand in hand with her mother through these same halls. She had been transferred to the capital for specialized follow-up, courtesy of the new National Program for Chronic Disease Care. Her father, as Traoré had promised, now worked in the local administration of Gaoua. The family was reunited for the first time in years. "Are you nervous?" her mother asked, as they waited outside a door bearing the presidential seal. Amina shook her head, though a slight tremor in her hand betrayed her emotion. The 8-year-old had become something of a national celebrity, her story told in schools, across the country, as an example of how one person's courage could change everything. The door opened and an aide invited them to enter. The presidential office was surprisingly austere, without the luxuries that had characterized previous governments. The simple furnishings reflected perfectly the personality of its occupant, functional, honest, and focused on substance rather than show. Ibrahim Traoré rose to greet them, abandoning the documents he was reviewing. His face lit up with genuine joy at seeing the transformed child. "Amina!" he exclaimed with authentic delight. "Look at you! I almost don't recognize you." The transformation was remarkable. The frail child from the provincial hospital now radiated health and vitality. Her cheeks had regained their color, her eyes sparkled with life, and her movements showed the energy typical of a healthy 8-year-old. "Mr. President," she greeted him with a small, practiced curtsy. "Thank you for inviting us." "On the contrary, thank you for coming. I have something important to show you." Traoré led them to a large screen on the wall. With a few touches on his tablet, he displayed a digital map of Burkina Faso dotted with green and yellow points, each representing a healthcare facility in the national system. "Do you see?" he asked, his voice filled with pride at what had been accomplished. "These points are hospitals and health centers. The green ones are already operating under the Amina protocol. The yellow ones will implement it in the coming weeks." Amina's mother gazed in amazement at the map. More than half the country was covered with green points, representing a transformation that had seemed impossible just months before. "All this because of what happened with my daughter?" she asked, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of change that had followed their family's moment of crisis. Traoré gently corrected her perspective. "No. All this thanks to your daughter. Her courage in asking me to stay exposed to a system that had failed thousands of people. She reminded all of us, especially me, why we hold these positions." The meeting was interrupted by the entrance of the new Minister of Health, a young doctor who had worked 20 years in rural zones before being called to serve in the capital. His appointment had signaled Traoré's commitment to placing healthcare professionals, rather than political appointees, in charge of the nation's health system. "Excuse the interruption, Your Excellence. The WHO representatives have arrived for the signing of the agreement." "Thank you, Doctor. I'll be with them in 5 minutes," Traoré replied before turning back to his special guests. "Today we'll sign an accord for Burkina Faso to become the regional center for medicine distribution for all of West Africa," he explained to them. "But before that, I have something for you, Amina." From his desk drawer, he extracted a small metallic object, a medal bearing the national seal, crafted specifically for this moment. "This is the first medal of civil courage in our country's history," he explained as he carefully pinned it to Amina's dress. "It will be awarded to citizens who, like you, have the courage to raise their voice against injustice." Amina observed the medal with wonder, barely believing that something so beautiful and important could be meant for her. "But I only asked you not to leave," she murmured in confusion, her childlike honesty cutting through all ceremony. Traoré knelt to her level, meeting her eyes directly as he had that first day in the provincial hospital. "Sometimes the simplest words are the most powerful, Amina. Your request forced me to see what many wanted to keep hidden." The president's words were broadcast that evening on national television as part of the official ceremony where Amina received her recognition. The image of the little girl with her medal quickly became a symbol of the new healthcare policy, shared across social media platforms and featured in international news coverage. But not everyone celebrated these changes. In the residence of the French ambassador, a discreet meeting brought together representatives of European pharmaceutical companies and former officials displaced by the reforms. The atmosphere was tense as powerful interests confronted an unexpected challenge to their profitable arrangements. "This is seriously affecting our interests," argued the regional director of a multinational pharmaceutical company, his usual confidence replaced by visible concern. "With the transparency system, we cannot maintain our usual profit margins, and local generic production threatens to completely expel us from the market." The ambassador, a career diplomat with decades of experience in Africa, maintained a pragmatic facade while internally calculating the political costs of different responses. Traoré has consolidated his position. The popularity of the Amina protocol makes him practically untouchable politically. "There must be something we can do," insisted a former minister whose comfortable corruption had been disrupted by the reforms. "No one is invulnerable to pressure." The conversation gradually shifted toward increasingly dark alternatives: economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, even more direct forms of interference. None of the participants noticed the young Burkina waiter serving drinks, who listened with professional attention while memorizing every word spoken. Hours later, in a peripheral neighborhood of Ouagadougou, that same waiter delivered a recording to an intelligence officer. The network of citizen informants, another recent innovation, was beginning to bear fruit in unexpected ways. The next morning, Traoré received the complete report of the embassy meeting. His expression remained inscrutable as he listened to the plans discussed for destabilizing his government and reversing the healthcare reforms. "What are your orders, Mr. President?" asked the security chief, his hand hovering over a folder containing arrest warrants. "Should we deport the ambassador, arrest the local implicated parties?" Traoré considered the options in silence, weighing diplomatic consequences against national interests. Finally, he made a decision that surprised everyone in the room with its subtlety. "Invite the ambassador to visit the central hospital tomorrow. Make sure he tours the new pediatric installations." He paused thoughtfully, "and coordinate it to coincide with Amina's monthly visit." The officer seemed confused by the indirect approach. "Sir, wouldn't more direct action be—" "Sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones your enemies don't see coming," Traoré interrupted with a slight smile that his military colleagues recognized as preceding his most successful operations. The strategy was as elegant as it was effective. The next day, cameras that happened to be present captured the French diplomat touring the hospital that, just months before, had lacked basic medicines due in part to exploitative commercial practices by European companies. The climactic moment came when he encountered Amina, now a national celebrity whose story had been featured in international media. The child, without any prior scripting, told her story and explained how the president had kept his promise to improve health care for all children. The images circled the globe within hours. The ambassador, trapped between the evidence of the program's success and the plans he had discussed to sabotage it, found himself in an impossible position. International public opinion, already sympathetic to the David versus Goliath narrative of a small African nation standing up to global pharmaceutical interests, rallied around Amina's story. A week later, Paris discreetly announced the ambassador's transfer to another destination. Pharmaceutical contracts were renegotiated under terms more favorable to Burkina Faso. The conspiracy had been neutralized without a single arrest through simple exposure to public scrutiny. For the first anniversary of the Amina Protocol, Burkina Faso's health system showed remarkable advances that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Child mortality had decreased by 30%. Medicine supply reached 90% of health centers. Most importantly, public confidence in institutions was experiencing a renaissance not seen in decades. In a commemorative ceremony, Traoré returned to the provincial hospital of Gaoua, where everything had begun. The building, now renovated and expanded, barely resembled the deteriorated medical center of a year before. New wings had been added, equipment upgraded, and staff increased to serve the growing number of patients who now sought care without fear of being turned away due to inability to pay. Amina accompanied him as a special guest, her role as national symbol accepted with the natural grace of childhood. At 8 years old, she had assumed with remarkable maturity her place in the country's transformation story. Schools, scholarships, and even a new locally produced vaccine carried her name. "Do you remember this place?" Traoré asked, as they walked through the pediatric ward, now bright and filled with the latest medical equipment. "Some things," she replied, looking around with the wonder of someone seeing a familiar place completely transformed. "But it looks very different now." They arrived at the bed by the window where that first encounter had occurred. Now it was occupied by a young boy with appendicitis, receiving proper care and on track for full recovery, a routine procedure that had once been complicated by lack of basic supplies. Traoré paused for a moment, as if he could see the ghost of Amina, from a year ago, weak but determined, reaching out to grasp his sleeve and beg him not to leave. "You know, Amina, many people ask me why I decided to stay that day. They wonder if it was a political strategy or a carefully designed plan." "Wasn't it?" she asked with the directness characteristic of her age, unafraid to question even the president of her country. Traoré smiled, appreciating her honesty as much as he had that first day. "No, it was something much simpler. I saw in your eyes the same fear and hope I felt as a child when my own mother fell ill and we couldn't afford her medicines." It was the first time the reserved president had shared something so personal publicly. The journalists present leaned forward unconsciously, eager to capture every word of this rare glimpse into their leader's motivation. "I promised myself then that if I ever had power, I would change that system. When you took my hand, you reminded me of that forgotten promise. You reminded me why I became a soldier first and president second." Amina, with the intuitive wisdom of children who have faced serious challenges, understood the depth of what she was hearing. She took the president's hand again, just as she had done that first day when everything changed. "I'm glad you stayed," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of gratitude not just from her family, but from thousands of families across the nation who had benefited from the reforms that followed. "So am I, Amina," Traoré replied, his voice thick with emotion that surprised those who knew him as a controlled military leader. "So am I." The ceremony continued with the announcement of new healthcare initiatives, mobile clinics for remote areas, telemedicine programs connecting rural areas with specialists in the capital, and a national health insurance program that would ensure no family faced the choice between medical care and financial ruin. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Traoré announced the establishment of the Amina Foundation, a permanent institution dedicated to monitoring healthcare transparency and ensuring that the gains achieved would survive changes in government. "This foundation will be governed by citizens, not politicians," he declared to thunderous applause. "Healthcare workers, patients, community leaders, people who understand that healthcare is a right, not a privilege." Amina herself would serve on the Foundation's Youth Advisory Board when she came of age, ensuring that the voice of ordinary citizens would always be heard in healthcare policy decisions. As the sun set over Gaoua, painting the hospital walls in golden light, Traoré and Amina stood together at the same window where their paths had first crossed. The provincial town spread out before them, transformed like so much of the country by the simple act of a child asking a powerful man to stay and help. "What will you be when you grow up, Amina?" Traoré asked, genuinely curious about the dreams of this remarkable young girl. She considered the question seriously, as she did all important matters. Maybe a doctor so I can help other children like me, or maybe a president so I can make sure the changes you started never get undone. Traoré laughed, delighted by her ambitious thinking. Why not both? This country will need leaders who understand that true power lies in service to others. The story of Amina and President Traoré continued to resonate far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. The Amina Protocol was studied and adapted by other African nations struggling with similar challenges of corruption and healthcare access. International development organizations used it as a model for transparency initiatives worldwide. Amina herself grew up in the spotlight, but never lost the directness and compassion that had first caught the president's attention. She excelled in school, often speaking at youth conferences about the importance of civic engagement and the power of ordinary citizens to create change. President Traoré continued his reforms across other sectors of government, always returning to the lesson taught by a sick child in a provincial hospital: that leaders serve best when they listen to those they govern, especially the most vulnerable. The hospital bed by the window in Gawa. Provincial Hospital was preserved as a small memorial with a simple plaque reading, "Here began the transformation of a nation's healthcare system when a child asked her president not to leave and he chose to stay." But perhaps the most enduring legacy was the change in how Burkinabe citizens viewed their relationship with their government. No longer passive recipients of whatever services politicians chose to provide, they became active participants in holding leaders accountable. The phrase, "Don't leave, please," became a rallying cry for citizen engagement, a reminder that even the most powerful officials serve at the pleasure of the people. Years later, when foreign dignitaries visited Burkina Faso to study its healthcare transformation, they were always told the same story: how a 7-year-old girl's simple plea to a president changed the course of a nation. It became a testament to the truth that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power to change the world. The story of Amina Diallo and Ibrahim Traoré proved that authentic leadership isn't about grand gestures or political theater. It's about having the courage to see suffering, the wisdom to understand its causes, and the determination to create lasting change. Most importantly, it's about remembering that behind every policy decision are real people with real needs, children, who should never have to beg for the medicine that could save their lives. In the end, both the president and the little girl learned the same lesson: that true strength lies not in commanding others, but in serving them with integrity, compassion, and unwavering commitment to justice. Their story continues to inspire new generations of leaders across Africa and beyond, proving that the future belongs to those who choose to stay and fight for what is right, especially when it would be easier to simply walk away